do. And so I did warn them that I was in control. But this network, it behaved exactly like a normal Wi-Fi network, unless you actually connected to the BBC News website. Now, the day I gave this talk was Halloween a few years ago, and so I replaced the headline that they would see with a story about a zombie apocalypse occurring in London. So in this case, it was obviously fake, but if someone wanted to attack you in real life, it's likely that, for example, maybe they, rather than manipulating the data, they would just observe the data being transmitted and try to steal anything that was sensitive that had been sent. And fortunately, I should just say that the BBC News website is no longer vulnerable to this as of last year.
So you were able to break into the BBC?
Oh, sorry. I should clarify this. At no point did I break into the BBC or access any of their servers. This was just at the point that the website was delivered to the user. So it was happening on the router that I was running that they had connected to, rather than in any way damaging any BBC assets.
So someone who was at the conference wanting to tune into the BBC News would get your thing about zombies instead of the real thing?
If they were connected to dubious fake network, then yes.
I see.
But if they were connected to dubious fake network, perhaps they shouldn't have been surprised by that.
I see. Okay.
So finally, I'd like to talk about an attack on user devices. So this is a little different from the previous attacks, because these could be out of the website's control. And so in this instance, let's say an attacker wants to infect the devices somehow, for example, using a phishing email, like in the previous example. Sorry, not the previous, the example of you that I started with. But then the attacker can either take data from the device or wait until the user, say, connects to a website which they're sending sensitive data to, at which point the attacker can read that data and, again, exfiltrate it back. So you asked about how these attacks may happen, say how malware may take control. And the answer here is really there are software vulnerabilities out there, and these attacks often exploit them. And actually, most of the time, we're looking at publicly known vulnerabilities in third-party software. When you say, if you're talking about a company, you're not talking about their own software, but software that they're running from others.
Wait, I don't understand that point. Say that again.
Within a no company will run exclusively its own software. They run a software from a variety of vendors, potentially including themselves. And so any of this software which they're running on their network has the potential to contain a vulnerability. And often these are publicly known. They can be reported in the database called Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, which is totally public. Thousands of these are reported every year. And typically there are patches available, but often attacks will happen because people or companies have failed to ensure that these patches are actually installed to protect them against these vulnerabilities. So if we look at publicly reported vulnerabilities over time, we can see in the late 90s we were looking at a few hundred per year, but now, say in 2018, there were almost 16,000 of these reported. And this is actually...
Is that new ones per year? 16,000 new ones per year?
Yes. Or just under, yes.
Wow.
And so this is a good thing because these databases being public does help companies to understand what their risks are and understand when they're when they're vulnerable and when they need to patch their systems. But it's also very useful to attackers because they're often able to scan for vulnerabilities and see which companies are actually exposed to that threat. But there is another class of vulnerability, which is called zero-day vulnerabilities. And so it's much rarer that an attack will use one of these. And these are named 0 days because a defender has had 0 days of knowledge about this bug before it's used. So having not known about it, they haven't had a chance to fix this vulnerability. And it often requires sophistication to identify because a company will typically be able to prevent a lot of the low-hanging fruit, for example. And so if no one else has caught them before it's been attacked, then that innately means it's going to be harder to find them. But using them doesn't necessarily require this same degree of sophistication, because it's often possible to buy exploits for zero-day vulnerabilities, for example, through criminal networks. And I believe that's the end of this section.
Your Honor, is this a time when you'd like to take the short break?
Yes, this would be a good time, and let's see, you've used about almost 20 minutes, so not quite. So we'll resume there
Okay.
and take a 15 to 20-minute break. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
All rise and come to order. Court is back in session.
All right, be seated. Thank you. And before we resume, please be seated. Before we resume, I've got to ask two questions. For all of the people up there, be sure to speak into the microphone so that the recording, meaning the television recording, catches what is spoken. That's one point. Second is, will counsel on both sides send me your deck of slides? Actually, send them to the court clerk. And do you have any problem with us putting on the court website for public view the slide decks that you sent in?
That's fine, Your
Okay.
Honor.
Both sides okay with that?
Yes, Judge.
All right, please do that sometime today. All right, next witness or next presenter.
Thank you, Your Honor. The next person who will present on the subject of what the attackers, what the criminals do with compromised data is someone who's very able to speak to this. He is a partner at Latham Watkins, where he's one of the co-heads of our firm's cybersecurity and data privacy practice. But more importantly, he spent 10 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, where he was the lead cybercrime prosecutor for the office. During his time at the U.S. Attorney's Office, he handled a wide range of cases involving computer hacking, trafficking in stolen data, and as well as major investigations, undercover operations, takedowns of criminal websites that operate on the dark web. Amongst other notable cases, Mr. Turner led the prosecution of the operator of the infamous Silk Road website, which was a vast online black market that operated on the dark web. Mr. Turner also was involved in supervising what is now publicly known, at the time was very confidential, an FBI sting operation known as Operation Card Shop, which was an extensive undercover investigation into criminals who were involved in hacking and stealing credit card data, which could be used for identity theft. So Mr. Turner will try to help you understand the mind of the criminal from this perspective.
All right, excellent. Thank you.
Morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
So Mr. Milliken talked about some of the ways that attackers can compromise user data. I'm going to talk about what they do with that data once it's been compromised. And the short answer is that it depends. It depends on what the attacker's objectives are and what kind of data they compromise. So there are there's a diverse population of attackers out there, and they can have very different motives and very different playbooks. So one actor set you hear a lot about these days is nation states. Nation states can use hackers for political, military, espionage purposes. That is a pretty small set of actors, very sophisticated. By far the biggest group of actors out there is cyber criminals. Broadly speaking, their motivation is to turn a profit, to monetize their access to data somehow. But they have lots of different business models that they may use to do so. So certainly a common one, and one we heard a little bit about in the plaintiff's presentation, is identity theft, stealing people's identities and using them to consummate financial transactions. And I'll speak to more on that in a minute. But there are other ways, too, that attackers have of monetizing their activity that don't involve financial fraud on the affected users. So one example is extortion. A hacker may target particularly sensitive information like compromising photos or compromising private messages and threaten to release them unless the user pays them off. Another completely different example would be spamming. So spamming is, abusive marketing, mass sending of emails out. And spammers sometimes use compromised email or customer lists to target their solicitation activity. They make money from the advertising messages they send. Could be based on the number of people that they can reach, or they may get paid by commission from the sales that they generate. And again, these are just examples. There really are a lot more ways, but those are some of the more common examples. Briefly, there are a couple other actor sets that you see from time to time. Hacktivists, that refers to ideologically motivated actors whose objective isn't so much as to make a profit as it is to draw attention to their cause somehow, embarrass their enemies, often by hacking into systems and then leaking the information into the public domain. So, for example, hacktivists might compromise personal data about a particular individual or particular business and leak it on a public website to embarrass the person or encourage other people to harass them. It's a practice often known as doxing. And finally, yes.
Okay, wait. Explain that one to me again, and spell that word. D-O-X?
D-O-X-I-N-G.
All right, and what does it mean again?
So it means that you can take personal information about somebody and leak it to embarrass them, or you can provide information about specifics about where they live to try to get people to harass them at their house.
I got it, okay. What's a problem judges have?
Yes, I've been involved in some cases.
We have the marshals working on that very problem. Okay, all right.
Finally, the last one I'd mention, Your Honor, is hacking by competitors or insiders. Sometimes attackers seek information that they can use for some form of competitive business advantage. You see this often from people who leave one company and go to another, but they retain credentials or something like that. They may try to use that access to gain access to valuable intellectual property or trade secrets and use that information to compete against essentially the victim of the hack.
So that would be company A has an employee who leaves, goes to company B, and that employee somehow has credentials to get into his original employer so he can continue to monitor, or she can monitor trade secrets and so forth.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a common fact pattern you see, or they have some back door to get in. It doesn't have to be a former employee. It can be just some independent competitor.
Okay.
So, as I said, attackers do vary widely in their objectives, and as a corollary to that, they vary in the types of data that they target. Some data obviously is useful for certain objectives, but not for others. So, taking identity theft as an example, I just want to focus for a minute on what types of data hackers target when they're looking for data that's useful for identity theft, and how they typically monetize that data. So the types of data useful to identity thieves are the kinds of data that you need to authorize a payment or to validate a person's identity to a financial institution or an online store or some other entity that you can conduct a financial transaction with. So credit card information is obviously a classic example. Fraudsters can use that information to make online purchases. Another example would be payment account credentials. Something like a PayPal account, a username and a password for a PayPal account. That can be useful. You can also have, though, non-financial account credentials that attackers can recycle. So, for example, because users often use the same usernames and passwords for multiple sites, you could have a hacker compromise the usernames and passwords for a website for cat lovers or something like that.
For what?
For cat lovers or whatever. I mean, it's a non-sensitive website by itself, but then the attacker can try those same usernames and passwords at lots of different sites, including banks, including stores, see if they work, and get into accounts that way. That's a practice known as credential stuffing. Social security numbers That would be a different type of example. Obviously, you can't make payments with Social Security numbers, but that's the sort of information that can often be essential to validating a person's identity to a financial institution, so that you can open up a new credit line in their name, for instance, or possibly take over their account. In the plaintiff's presentation, there was a mention of like challenge and response. You know, when you're trying to validate your identity to a financial institution, they ask you for certain information. They're going to ask you things for things like mother's maiden name plus last 4 digits of your social, things like that. And I should add, Your Honor, there was a mention earlier about definitions of PII, personal identity information. The states, the state governments of the U.S., all have different breach notification requirements, and they have definitions of the types of data that trigger those notification requirements. And the definitions typically center on this type of data. It's data that's used for financial identity theft. So it doesn't just say first and last name. If that's breached, that requires notification. It says if first and last name of a person has been breached in addition to or in combination with Social Security number, or driver's license number, or financial account credentials, things like that. That's typically what's covered by state breach notification requirements, because this is the sort of danger they're designed to protect against. So typically the hackers who obtain this sort of data don't commit the identity theft themselves. Instead, they harvest it and sell it to others who do. And that's where the dark web comes in, Your Honor. And that's a subject I'm intimately familiar with. As a former prosecutor, I had several major investigations dealing with sites on the dark web. So just to talk about that term for a minute and to clarify terminology, before you heard the term dark web and dark net, I want to make one more distinction. This is a pet peeve of mine. These terms are often thrown around together. Deep web versus dark web. Deep web just refers to content on the internet that has not been indexed by search engines, which is actually a huge portion of the web. So if you take the internet, the web is a part of the internet. The deep web is a huge part of the web. If you have a Gmail account, Your Honor, and you go to your Gmail page, you're looking at part of the deep web because your Gmail account is not something you can find by searching for it in Google. So that's all deep web means. The dark web is a very small part of the web, and that refers to something much different. It's typically a term typically used to refer to websites whose IP address is hidden from public view using specialized technologies, including the Tor network. As Your Honor may or
How can that, if it's hidden from view, how can it be, how can anyone even find them then?
well, technically, it's very complex under the hood. As was referred to earlier, it involves a lot of bouncing of traffic between different nodes until it gets to the other point of the traffic. But from a user's perspective, it's actually quite simple. For a user's perspective, I have a slide in a minute, you can just download the Tor browser, install in your system. There's a picture of it there. And then there you go. Once you install it, you can access sites on the Tor network. You don't know their IP address. They don't know your IP address. In terms of where you find the addresses to type in, that information is often publicly discussed on the surface web, on the ordinary web. So there could be chat rooms or just news articles or whatever that mention there's this website out there and you can find it at this address. The addresses are long strings of text and numbers that end with .onion, but other than that, they're fairly easy to reach. So it's important to emphasize not all the activity on the dark web is nefarious in nature. I mean, it's used, for example, by human rights activists that are trying to evade surveillance by, what they view as repressive governments. There's obviously other legitimate applications for it as well. But it is used by criminals because it helps them hide their IP addresses from law enforcement. And that allows them to operate these websites relatively openly, hiding in plain sight. So examples include dark markets, and that's where criminal goods and services are sold of all sorts, including drugs, including fake passports, including pirated software.
Do you have a slide that would show me what one of those look like?
I do, just coming up, Your Honor. So here's an example. This is Alpha Bay, which was actually successfully shut down by law enforcement a couple years ago. And as you can see from the browse categories list on the left-hand side, it's essentially an online department store for all sorts of criminal goods and services. Fraud, drugs and chemicals, counterfeit items, that would be things like counterfeit passports, et cetera, digital products, counterfeit software, and here, this is under digital goods, might as well be under fraud as well, are banking fulls. So before you heard the term fulls during the plaintiff's tutorial, this is what fulls are. It's actually a technical term of art, a fairly technical term of art on the dark web. And what fulls mean are full account information, typically from a bank or financial institution or a retail store. And as you can see, especially from a financial institution, banking fulls include things like Social Security number, driver's license number, information about net income, all the things that you would need to impersonate someone to their bank to get control of their account or to open up a new account in the person's name. And as you can see here, you can get this information directly on dark web websites for cheap. This is $2 per account. And this is typical. There is a glut of this information on the dark web. Unfortunately, it's widely available to identity thieves who want it. So
What would you do? You'd go, I know you say you shut that one down, but you'd go to that site and say you want to get 10 of these accounts, and so you would give them $20, and they would, they would then send it to you over the internet?
yes. And you pay for it using bitcoins or other cryptocurrency. So, you know, they're not taking credit cards on these sites, but they're taking digital currency that can often be hard for law enforcement to trace.
And this could be operating anywhere in the world. It wouldn't necessarily even have to be in the USA.
Correct. It could be hosted in the USA, but that would be completely invisible to the user and very hard to determine.
How many sites like that do you think they're operating right now?
I don't have an exact count, but there would be a number. It would probably be dozens.
Dozens?
Hmm.
All right. And that is part of the dark.
That's part of the dark web.
Okay.
But as I said, that's not the only business model used by cyber criminals. And as a counterpoint, I wanted to talk for a minute about spamming, which I mentioned earlier. Okay, so spammers engage in abusive mass marketing, and they don't need to perpetrate identity theft as part of their activity. So they're not looking for the sort of data that we were just seeing on Alpha Bay. They don't need social security numbers, that sort of thing. They're looking for contact information and marketing information that they can use to target their solicitation activities. Sometimes, certainly not always, but sometimes that information comes from hacking. So for example, there have been major data breaches where the data stolen consisted simply of email addresses and names. That information by itself is of very little value to identity thieves. But it is useful to spammers, potentially, seeking to blast out messages to as many users as possible. And
What would those messages say?
all sorts of things. So often spam is used to sell things like off-brand drugs, male enhancements, many, many things. It's the click rate, the rate of actually generating a sale can be very, very small. There was one study that showed, like, I forget what it was, but something like 1/10,000th of 1% of recipients actually, purchase something. But that's the game, is to send out messages to as many people as possible to get a click, to get a buyer.
If you send out 1 million, you might get 100. that it? Is that
Something
the
like
idea?
that.
Okay. Okay. And then are these real sales, or are they just phony sales?
Both, Your Honor. It could be both. So similarly, customer profile information, like where a person's from or what their education level is, that can be useful to spammers just as it is to ordinary marketers, because it can be used to target spamming activity. When this data is hacked, you don't necessarily expect to see it show up on dark market websites. It's not really where it's ordinarily sold. Unlike something like a list of credit card numbers, which is obviously illicit on its face to sell, the contact and marketing information may not appear illicit on its face necessarily, depending on how it's presented. And so you actually can see this data sometimes just sold on the ordinary or surface web. So, I think the basic point here, Your Honor, is it's just important to distinguish between these types of information because, a lot of the assumptions that you might have in a case where information like credit card data is stolen or Social Security numbers are stolen would not equally apply in a case where something like contact or marketing information has been compromised. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so let's go to your next presenter.
Your Honor, we're back with Mr. Milliken is going to resume on the subject of how companies, or as you said, the industry generally defends against attack, and then he'll talk about how Facebook's general approach to security complies with
Yeah, you
that.
got a little less than 20 minutes. So.
That's fine, Your Honor.
All right, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to first
Be
address...
sure to use the mic now.
Yes. So I'm going to address a little about how companies defend against attacks. And to start with, it's worth stressing that there is no magic bullet solution here. There's no real simple answer of how we should defend as an industry. It would be wonderful if there were, for example, some single product or technology that we could all deploy. It would certainly make my life a lot easier in working in security, but unfortunately this doesn't exist. And so instead, what's necessary is a series of different individual security measures, which can then each be effective against some limited set of risks. And so Your Honor asked to hear about encryption today. And this is a great example of the principle of security measures, which are very powerful in some situations, but not so powerful in others. And so encryption is this process of encoding data so that it can only be read by those who have the necessary key. So if you have a piece of data to encrypt, which we call the plain text, then you can pass it through an encryption algorithm using an encryption key to get something which is now essentially unreadable, and we call this the ciphertext. And that is unreadable to anyone who doesn't possess the decryption key, which they can use alongside the decryption algorithm to recover the plain text. And in some contexts, the encryption and decryption key will be the same, in some they won't. And as I say, this is very important security control in some situations, but not others. But let's look at a couple of places where it can be effective. So the first is encryption of data at rest. And so data at rest encryption is really encryption of stored data. For example, if you have data stored in a database. So if we look back at this attack where someone has actually got into the company network with malware, they're accessing a database. And so their goal is to exfiltrate data from this database. And they want to steal the data this way. But now all they've stolen is ciphertext, which is meaningless to them. And so for them to actually complete this attack, it requires access to the decryption keys, and then it's possible for the company to sometimes defend these decryption keys a little more than the database. They can be more locked down. And another example where encryption is very useful is encryption of data in transit. So for example, when you securely connect to a website. So the first thing that happens here is something that's called the handshake, which happens between your device and the remote web server. And a couple of things happen here, but one of them is that encryption keys are decided upon, which are then shared between these two ends, which can then communicate securely. And so, for example, when connecting to a secure website, we will typically see HTTPS, HTTP being the standard protocol used to communicate with websites, and S being added to indicate that this is now secure. So now if we look back at the attacker attacking the network, so this is like the attack that I had demonstrated with the BBC. An attacker in this situation can now only access the ciphertext, and so they have no way of actually reading or manipulating this data. And this is how, for example, the BBC is no longer vulnerable to the attack I performed a few years ago.
Well, let me ask you a question. Let's say that the hacker is monitoring the entire exchange of information. Wouldn't the hacker then have eavesdropped on what the keys were going to be so that they could now decode everything?
That's a very good question, Your Honor. So what actually happens within this key exchange is it's called asymmetric cryptography, and I probably won't get into too many of the details of this, but essentially it's similar to the situation I described before, where the encryption and the decryption keys are different. And so in this situation, for example, the two ends can send each other their encryption keys, but not the decryption keys, and hold the decryption keys sensitive. And so any data that's transmitted, having used the encryption keys, is still secure because the decryption key has never been sent. This isn't exactly how it works in this situation, but it's...
So the answer is the hacker cannot decode. Even if they monitor the entire exchange,
that's correct,
they
yes.
don't get enough of the keys to decode.
Exactly.
Well, why wouldn't everybody do that? Or is that the way it works? Everyone does that.
So HTTPS is becoming increasingly common on the internet, yes.
Okay. All right, so if you remember the example you gave earlier, you're at the Wi-Fi coffee shop using free Wi-Fi.
Yes.
Would this kind of encryption save you in that situation so that no one could monitor your they might monitor it, but they wouldn't be able to decode it? Is that the way it would work?
Exactly, yes. They would not know what data was being transmitted.
I see. Okay. All right, good. Go ahead.
So this is very powerful, of course, but there are situations where the security goals that we desire can't be achieved through encryption. So, for example, if there's a website where someone may log into their account and expect to see their data, then this website needs to be able to transmit this data to the user. If it had some ciphertext which it sent to the user, which the user couldn't decrypt, that wouldn't be useful. So they need to be able to send the plain text, even if it is encrypted in transit. And so, for example, this does mean, though, that if an attacker is able to access a user's account in such a system, then because they're impersonating this user, any data that's visible to this account could also be transmitted to the attacker.
Wait, go through that again. So let's say you have an account that's in the cloud. You're saying that the information in the cloud should be in plain text and stored in plain text?
So it doesn't necessarily need to be stored in plain text, but it needs to be accessible to the company in plain text. So, for example, if I'm logging into my Gmail account, it doesn't really matter how Google stores that, but they need to be able to load it into their web server and then transmit it to me in a form that I can actually read. And so if someone else were accessing my Gmail account, they would also have that data transmitted to them.
But couldn't Gmail use these keys to encrypt it in transit?
They can, yes. So it's encrypted in transit between so my web browser and them, and an attacker's web browser and them. But if an attacker has actually gained access to my account, then the keys which are used to transmit the data aren't relevant in this situation because this transit encryption ensures that the two endpoints are still able to decrypt the data. So
Okay.
we're not defending against a network attacker in this situation.
Right?
But that was a very good question. So, if encryption can't provide our magic bullet, what do we actually need? Because this principle does extend to all security measures, really. There is no single security measure which can provide a complete solution to protection, and instead we need to provide comprehensive security programs using broad range of controls. So we've listed a few of these potential options on the slide. Of course, there are more that may be needed. But the big thing really is